self-destructive narratives. Now, this goes back for thousands of years, but it has taken a a dramatic uh, turn that many of us are witnessing here in the present. And what do I mean by self-destructive and listening to self-destructive narratives? Well, the term self-destructive should be apparent, but for those of you who don't get it, let me explain. If you put your hand on a on your stovetop while it's on, then uh, knowing that you'll get burnt, that's self-destructive. Now that's just a simple, basic analogy of what I mean by self-destructive. But there are more insidious and nefarious self-destructive behavior. And you only need to know a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your psychology to understand what self-destructive behavior can come back and hurt you in the immediate, in the near future. So this is about self-destructive behavior that has brought about the unnecessary and ultimately self-destructive racism issue. Now, why is this self-destructive? Well, because, and this is targeted mostly for the white communities. Understand something. You have bought into a self-destructive narrative by people who have self-interest and do not care if you are the same skin color. There's a big difference between white middle America, working class middle America, and even those who are in the upper middle class white America. To those who are upper class white America. Now, even going back towards the founding of this country, the United States of America, these upper class, self-appointed whites took advantage of a self-destructive narrative they knew would work for them, but disadvantage everybody else, and purposely bring harm to those others, such as blacks and Native Americans. Now, why would somebody do that? We've all watched movies and TV shows and read books and so on and so forth, and even reports in in the quote unquote news media. And that's a dangerous term, news and reporting. Why? Because it's misleading. Because when you put the word news or reporting or journalists in front of you, then it's automatically assumed by the vast majority, whether it doesn't matter what your skin color is or the shape of your eyes, or whether you have a different sounding name other than Western, the old European Western names. So when that happens, we have a tendency to accept the narrative, thereby self-destructive narrative, without checking it first, without thinking it through and rationalizing it and saying, is this in fact have any relevance? Is this in fact have any truth? Or could it be misleading? Or could it be outright lie? Or could it be a fabrication? If we don't question it and we buy into it based on our own individual take on our own individual lives, and we don't question the narrative, then we buy into it. And when we buy into it, and that narrative is misleading and harmful, then we are personally responsible for taking the narrative and consuming it and making it a part of us. I'll give you a prime example in my own personal life. Now, I was born in 1971 in Seoul, South Korea. And and somewhere around 5 years of age, me and my brother were sent to an orphanage in Korea, South Korea. We were later adopted by a wonderful couple, and they were a white couple, and they adopted us, and we were naturalized in the 80s. Now, my parents are lovely people. But that doesn't mean that they are without flaws, because we are all without flaws. And the thing is growing up in Massachusetts, in Canton, Massachusetts, and listening to the media. And when I say media, I'm not just talking about news media, your print news or your TV news. I'm talking about also about the media, such as cartoons, TV shows, movies. Watching all this, there was a direct link to what was portrayed in TV, print, and books, and also on what I learned in school. Now, I'm not sure what the current textbooks, historical textbooks, and a few other textbooks that are in your elementary schools and your middle schools and your high schools. But growing up, and this is a prime thing that irritates me and angers me, is the blatant blatant use of historical textbooks to basically put in my mind, and I'm sure in every other students' mind. A very, very false and warped narrative of history, especially for the United States. Um, Prime example: Christopher Columbus was portrayed as this heroic figure, this charismatic, this um, courageous adventurer, who helped to find the Americas, the New World. And there are so many falsehoods in that and outright lies. The entire thing about Christopher Columbus was an outright fabricated lie. There, by giving you a misconception, a falsehood, a false narrative. Because we now know Christopher Columbus was a homicidal maniac. He was one of the most vile people ever to have existed. And this isn't just, I'm not just talking about this um, as a minority or someone who sees value in progressing and being progressive. No, I'm talking about this in the fact that Christopher Columbus wrote it in his own journals and diary, in his own words, his vileness. He incriminated himself in his own words. And these can be found and looked at in person. And then there are others that were with him who wrote about his tyrannical, rapacious, and evil and um, vile, vindictive, and murderous ideology. This man was only concerned with getting himself putting himself in a better light and to enrich himself and make himself famous in the eyes of the people who were funding him. And the people who were funding him were monarchs. And they ignored his murderous rampage, knowing what he did. And they put out a narrative that showed to the public that the indigenous were the bad guys and that Columbus and the people that Columbus um, got to help were helping. So he was made out to be a hero, along with all these other murderers, and rapists, and torturers, and butcherers, with only a few who actually wrote down in their own private journals and private diaries of the vile, evil, criminal acts that Columbus and the monarchs and the upper echelons that Columbus served, and how they were ignoring all this to enrich themselves. And this, bring it forward. This is the same thing that is happening and keeps happening. So when I say self-destructive, I mean self-destructive in those terms. The founding of the United States of America used the same narrative, the same misconceptions, the same lies and fabrications They used the white community, the lesser white community, the ones that did not have influence, did not have the money to destroy themselves. And one of the tactics they used was the same tactics that Columbus and the establishment behind him used. So I forget the name of the gentleman. He's a uh, uh, American historian, and he speaks about this. And one of the things that he says in all of his speeches is that the landowners, the wealthy, the self-appointed landowners, and the wealthy, the ones with influence and power, were so bad, were so um, rapacious that the black people and the white people had a common cause. And so, seeing this happening by the elites, they turned around and said, "Well, look, it's the slaves, it's the Native Americans, it's this," and they blamed everybody else, and they said, "Look, at least you have the same skin color that I do, and so we'll give you a little bit more privilege." So help us, help yourselves. So that was the exact sort of narrative that they did. And the white community followed this narrative, this self destructive narrative, and bought into it for a very temporary and ultimately destructive formula that still only enriched and gave more power and gave more influence to the elites. And by doing this, and by persecuting the blacks who had more in common, and actually everything in common with the white community, because blacks were not the only slaves. The whites, the white people, were virtual slaves. There is literally almost no difference between a serf and a slave, or an indentured servant. Those are just semantics. A slave is a slave. When you give the power by accepting a self destructive narrative, you end up enriching and empowering those who are using, who want to use, who want to command, who want to control. It's that simple. And this is carried on throughout US history. Except in the future generations, they could say, oh, it's in the historical books. So it must be true that it was the blacks, that it was that it was this, that it was that. And when that didn't work, they turned it around to pointing at the whites, making you the enemy, making you the vile, by saying, oh, no, it's white people. It's white people, white privilege. So once again, the elites turned it around. So now that they had white people against white people against black people against white people, Hispanics against blacks against Hispanics. Asians against blacks, Hispanics against blacks, whites against Hispanics. You see where this insanity leads. And the only ones who profit, the only ones who gain more control and influence are the elites, the ones who already have it and want to keep it and to grow it. So this, so you just keep flipping that forward. And this is what racism has come to be. But we have to understand racism only serves the elites, the ones who have self appointed themselves to be the masters. Now, going back to as I was growing up, so I'm watching all this media, and I'm going through my education, and I'm listening to the narrative, and I'm looking up to my father and my mother. These are both wonderful people. They have a lot of heart. They have a lot of compassion, but they are just as ignorant. While they're not outright racist, they do not buy into that vileness. They are confused, and they have bought into the narrative, and they buy into the respectability, into uh, all the reverence of the media and the government. And when I say government, I'm talking about, I'm not just talking about your mayors or your representatives or your police. I'm talking about school boards, committees. You know, the whole thing is divide and conquer. And that's just not a military thing where military planners use it. Divide and conquer is a system that's used internally or domestically from the smallest level all the way up to the federal level. These are the sorts of things. And one of the elements is religion. Religion and religiosity and religious establishments are part of that divide and conquer. And sowing the seeds of doubt, of self-doubt, of respecting a narrative and condoning a narrative that's ultimately self-destructive. And I'm not talking about the great things that are I'm not talking about the great things that are in religious texts. I'm talking about the contradictory stuff that follows the exact game plan of this self-destructive narrative, of this divide and conquer, of finger pointing and putting a fear and instilling fear. That's what I'm talking about. So growing up, I watched this and I listened to my father and I bought into it for some time. But I started seeing things and hearing things, not just from watching the media and reading the newspapers and hearing things in my schools from my teachers and my textbooks, but also in my day-to-day life that just didn't ring true. That was just confusing. And being as young as I was, I, I knew there was something wrong. I just couldn't figure out what it was. But I also had bought into the black community was such a was a vile criminal and vile criminals, and they're the ones that. But that's completely false. That is completely and utterly false. But I bought into this, and I made some very ignorant and stupid things when I talked to other people who are black, because I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, actually an all white neighborhood, with the exception of, me and my brother and my sister and my sisters, three Koreans, one Cuban, all adopted. And the only other family that really was non-white were the songs, a Korean American family, and that was it. So when you so growing up and getting all this false information, this false narrative, all these lies contaminated me. But I picked up on it. Perhaps I'm fortunate because I'm I'm able I'm able to see. Anyways, I gotta get off because my phone is giving me this thing, and I gotta shut down. But we have to stop allowing them to make us uh, divide us and start thinking for ourselves and see the falsehoods, see the lies, and know the enemy. We got to know there's an old saying, know thyself. So we have to start knowing ourselves and seeing the truth and where it lies, who it benefits. Right now in the present, it's gone into hyperdrive. It's gone into the realms of insanity. So know the enemy, and the enemy is the establishment. Thank you for your time.